So what we have is a group of officers that are going to get out of their patrol vehicles and actually get out on foot in the neighborhood.
28 to 18, check your phone.
Once the officers are observed, that word will get around rather quickly, and at that time we'll see if there's any type of movement or suspicious activity.
For the Metro Police Department's Juvenile Crime Task Force, the search for kids with guns can take them into Nashville's most violent neighborhoods.
Yeah, no weapons or anything on you?
Where danger
Y'all, they're shooting down here.
is just around the corner.
Split your 2020.
Move. Here in the J.C. Napier housing projects off Lafayette, one round of gunshots was followed by another, and then another.
Just have Hermitage and Central flood this area so we can deal with this without having gunshots going around us.
You're down in this car.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden.
Yeah. You know, 6, 7, 8 police officers here, and right next to us, they're shooting each other.
Smith & Wesson 40. It's stolen out of Georgia.
The suspects this time were not juveniles, but a visit to the police department's evidence room.
Smith & Wesson 38 caliber handgun.
Provides a glimpse into the scope of the problem.
Kel-Tec 380 caliber handgun.
Every one of these handguns,
Glock 40 caliber handgun.
was taken off a kid
Smith & Wesson 9mm handgun.
on the streets of Nashville.
Ruger 380 caliber handgun.
40 in just a 2-month period. Over the past 5 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of juvenile charges for handgun possession.
We had 8 firearms that we recovered on one incident. That's a lot of guns to be in the hands of youth. It's just as we said, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Lieutenant Blaine Whitehead heads the Juvenile Crime Task Force.
There was one house that had guns stuffed in a teddy bear. We've got guns out of back of toilets, in refrigerators, in cereal boxes, you name it. We've probably found a gun there.
He says teens often steal handguns that have been left unsecured in cars that have been left unlocked.
Kids out here in the communities have no hesitation to steal a gun out of a car, carry that gun with them. They take them to schools, they take them to community events, they're taking them to other youth households with parents that don't even have an idea that youth brought that gun into the home. No hesitation whatsoever amongst a lot of the youth to pick these guns up.
Our investigation, putting names and faces to anonymous juvenile crime data, discovered that of the kids charged with homicide since 2016, at least a third had previous charges for handgun possession. Among them, 16-year-old Misha Brown. Brown was arrested September 18, 2017 for handgun possession. A week later, that charge was retired, and she was released on intensive gang probation. Just 6 weeks later, police say she shot and killed Racine Wallweather.
With the youth being arrested for a firearm, we know that there needs to be a consequence to that. A simple, even 30 days, if they know that they're going to be arrested and there's a consequence, they're not going to be free for 30 days, no matter what. Every time that you're caught with a firearm, they know 30 days I'm going to be in juvenile detention.
Juvenile court judge Sheila Calloway.
It goes back to the brain development. Youth aren't making good decisions because their brains aren't fully developed and they're getting their hands on deadly weapons and they're not putting it together what they can do with that. We've got to give them intensive services to make sure that they understand the seriousness of what it means for them to possess guns.
Why not put out the word, if you get caught with a gun, you will do 30 days detention?
Well, first and foremost, when we do not do detention as a sentence, and that's part of the state law.
In fact, when kids are caught with guns, Judge Calloway says that prosecutors usually do ask that they be held in detention until trial.
If they get held before their trial usually is about 30 days away. So in effect, they are spending a lot of time in detention on gun charges if that's something that they got detained on. But I definitely believe that each child has to be reviewed individually.
It's a Glock 9mm handgun.
Part of the problem, critics say, is that state law does not treat handgun possession by juveniles as a serious offense.
They're not treated as violent offenders. They're treated as misdemeanors.
Should they be? treated as violent offenders?
Inherently, I would argue that a juvenile possessing a handgun is a scary offense. Now, there is no category for scary offense.
Former juvenile prosecutor Jim Todd says transferring a repeat offender to adult court doesn't work.
If a juvenile court wanted to transfer a kid for possession of a handgun, they couldn't. It's a misdemeanor. You're going to transfer a kid from the juvenile system up to the adult court where he gets 11 months, 29 days probation? That doesn't make any sense.
Even if the judge wants to send a repeat offender to the State Department of Children's Services,
that child definitely could use a lot of intensive services, but because it is a misdemeanor, if that child is in the Department of Children's Services, the options are fewer for them.
Does that suggest that the system doesn't treat handgun possession as seriously as it should?
In some ways, I do think that the system doesn't treat handgun possession as serious as it should for juveniles.
One example, Derrick Jordan was first charged with handgun possession when he was 15. He spent almost a month in detention. After trial, he was released on probation. Less than a year later, he was arrested for carrying a gun to Pearl High School. He spent another month in detention. At trial, he was put on intensive gang probation. 2 months later, at age 16, another handgun possession charge. This time, he was sent to the State Department of Children's Services. At 17, he was charged with murder.
And get this, our investigation discovered 2 cases in which children who were implicated in homicides, who after going through the state juvenile system, returned to the streets and continue to get arrested for handgun possession.
14-year-old Mario Woodard was arrested in May 2017 for his role in a homicide inside Nashville's Casey Holmes housing project. He pleaded guilty to a lesser crime and was sent to DCS. He returned home in October 2018. Then in January, the data shows the 16-year-old was busted again for handgun possession and sent back to DCS. 2 months later, he was back out on the streets and arrested again, this time for auto theft and handgun possession.
We need to strengthen each other. We need to understand that we don't understand.
Perhaps most tragic, the accidental shooting of 15-year-old Devante Ziegler by a young friend who had found a handgun. The shooter, Kajon Oldham, was just 11 years old. Because of his age, homicide charges were dropped and he was placed in DCS custody. At age 12, he was arrested again for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Those charges were also dropped. At 13, auto theft and unlawful possession of a weapon, charges that were again retired. At 14, aggravated robbery and handgun possession, he was committed to the State Department of Children's Services. So far this year, he's been arrested twice for auto theft and once for handgun possession. At last count, he was in a residential treatment program.
Whenever you've had a child who's been involved in taking another life and comes to the system and starts picking up handgun charge after handgun charge, whatever we're doing isn't working.
Right. Yeah, we've got to do something better. And we've got to figure out what it is before we lose that child for good.
We have a motion on the amendment. Do we have a second? Second on the amendment.
And Tennessee's pro-gun legislature, the judge says, isn't helping.
You know, juveniles aren't allowed to go buy guns. And so we know they're not getting them at the store, but so they're getting them from places in the community.
Officials have seen an uptick in kids stealing guns since lawmakers made it legal in 2014 for Tennesseans to keep loaded handguns in their cars.
And what they're really doing is not necessarily breaking in where they're banging out windows and stuff. They're trying handles. They're going to open parking lots, trying handles, and if your door is open, they're looking in, and if you have a gun in that, that's a juvenile with a gun.
Many people leave the guns unprotected in their car, either under their seat or in the seat, or just not locked up when they are not in the car. Now,
this past session, legislation was filed to make it illegal to leave a handgun in an unsecured vehicle. But pro-gun lawmakers,
I think the legislation is good. I think the penalty could be a little too severe.
balked at making it a crime.
I wonder if there's different ways to achieve the results we're looking for this rather than having to expose typically law-abiding individuals to potential criminal charges, even though it's a fine only.
When they debate this, I want them to see the devastation of the victims of gun crimes in the hands of children. I want them to hear from, you know, some of these families who were unfortunate to have a a child that picked up a gun and shot someone. I want to hear them, the stories, not even the children that are using the guns for violent offenses, but the ones that are shooting people accidentally. I want them to hear about what happens when it's so easy to get access to a gun. If they heard these stories, if they heard about the victims and the family members that had to bury children because they played with a gun, then maybe they would make a different assessment on how they should vote for that bill.
Do you know which 99 we're using for the first